the Jewish community. This is the Everett Center's 17th year. The physical space was built through a generous donation by Edith Everett and her family in memory of her husband, Henry. Edith's goal was to create a Jewish community center with programs free of charge and 5 rooms for guests to rent. Her goal has been more than realized. Programs include talks and movies. Program brochures are available in the lobby, together with volunteer and suggestion forms. We welcome volunteers and suggestions. Our programming and operations are fully dependent on your donations. We don't get any money from the Chautauqua Institution. Your gate fees don't support us. Your tax deductible.
Turn off the phones.
I didn't get to that part yet. Your gate fees don't support us. Your tax deductible gifts help us to offer our programs and to expand our community. I invite you to join with me and donate to the Everett Jewish Life Center. You can donate online or by using a donation envelope there in the lobby. This week's speaker is generously sponsored by Daniel, Helen, Benjamin, and Sarah Horwitz in memory of Dr. Leonard Katz. Len was the first program chair at the Everett Jewish Life Center. Daniel Horwitz was Len's brother-in-law. Daniel will say a few words, then I'll introduce our speaker.
Helen and I are delighted that we could support Professor Nadell's talk. Len was many things: magician, husband, father, grandfather, father-in-law, brother-in-law, great-grandfather. But above all, he was an extraordinary person, as many of you know. Gentle, funny, kind, engaged. Helen and I have both labored in the same vineyards as Professor Nadell. We've both written biographies of women, me of an anti-Semite, an anti-Semite, the legendary president of Bryn Mawr College, M. Charlie Thomas, and me, a woman who fought for women and for Jews, Betty Friedan. But I have to say also, there are very few historians. We're in a book field, not an article field. There are very few historians who publish as many books as Professor Nadell has done under such a wide range of topics and that have reached such varied and ample audiences. So we're delighted you're here. Thank you.
It's my honor to introduce our speaker, Professor Pamela Nadell. Professor Nadell holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University. She spoke yesterday about her book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today. That book won the 2019 Everett Family Foundation Award from the National Jewish Book Council. It was named the Jewish Book of the Year. It was translated into Hebrew. I read it in English. I listened to the audio version, also in English. I want to tell you they're both excellent. Today's topic is her new book, which is entitled Anti-Semitism and American Tradition. It will be published in English in October 2025. To her chagrin, Dr. Nadell is probably best known for testifying before Congress in December December 2023, together with the presidents, all women, of Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania. She is relieved that so far no one has called to fire her. I'm almost finished. Please silence your phones and electronic devices. Please deposit your garbage in the garbage cans on the porch. Please note that, as in the past, there is significant security at Chautauqua. It has many components, and much of it takes place behind the scenes and is not visible. We all have a role to play. If you see something unusual, please say something to one of the ushers or one of us with a name tag. I'm finally finished. And now, Dr. Nadell.
Lovely introduction. Can you all hear me? Is the volume okay? Yeah.
Yesterday they couldn't hear outside.
I understand.
Yeah. How's that? Is that better? Yeah. Okay, good. Always good to check in the beginning. So, first of all, my apologies for sitting. I broke my arm a couple of weeks ago. Get a little tired, so I'm just not standing over there. But I also, I want to thank, first of all, Edith Everett for building this amazing house. The fact that I won the Everett Prize for my last book was so incredibly moving, and then to be here is just extraordinary. I want to thank Joan Alexander and her husband David for their warm hospitality, Arlene Hoffman, who invited me, Bobby and Joe, Lewis, the hosts of this house, and of course, especially Daniel and Helen and their family for sponsoring this in memory of their late brother-in-law, Len, and welcoming Judy, who's here for that. So I also want to mention I did put cards about the forthcoming book on your chairs. There's also lots of bookmarks. If you need bookmarks, there's bookmarks over there on the table from my last book. So I'm really excited to be giving this talk. This is my first pre-publication talk about anti-Semitism and American tradition. And do we have the slides up yet? Great. Okay, we're starting. And I really welcome your feedback because I've worked on this book for 6 years. This is not a book that is post October 7th. As Daniel is nodding knows, historians, we don't write that fast, right? Like I couldn't have written a book that fast. But that influenced obviously what I was thinking about, and the fact that so many people are here today to hear about this book and to give this talk in a venue like Chautauqua, a historic venue for 150 years that has promoted education and understanding and civil discourse is so meaningful to me. And so I really welcome your feedback and your comments, because while I will talk about the book, I'm also hopefully going to give you some insights into what is going on at this moment in time. Because if we don't know the past, we are not doomed to repeat it, but we cannot understand the present because the past echoes through the present. So I'm going to start with the present, with anti-Semitism today, and I'm going to start with a little bit less than about a decade of anti-Semitism in America. So some of you will remember 2017, August, Charlottesville, Virginia, where the main organizers of the Unite the Right rally, as they marched across the campus of the University of Virginia, I know you're about to move to Charlottesville, they marched across that campus and they yelled, "Jews will not replace us." But I don't think most people understood what they meant by that. And so I'm going to cycle back to that theme in this conversation. Under Virginia state law, the organizers of that rally on the UVA campus were charged in court. plaintiffs won a $25 million fee in damages, but the court deadlocked on whether or not they had actually committed federal conspiracy charges, and that was in November 2021. I haven't followed to see if they're still in the process of appeal around that, and I don't know to what extent the plaintiffs got, whether they ever actually collected on that. I was actually a backup I was going to be like a backup witness for that. I wrote something that got submitted to the court. So you remember that. You will probably remember this. The murders at the Tree of Life Synagogue, when a lone gunman burst into the Tree of Life Synagogue building where 3 different congregations were meeting and murdered 11 people in Pittsburgh on a Sabbath morning. And I am actually consulting to the rebuild of the Tree of Life building because it's now a museum dealing with American anti-Semitism. And I need to tell you that when I go to Pittsburgh and I have these meetings, the community is in shock. They are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, the people that I meet and talk to, because we never thought, I mean, they lived it. You know, they went to 11 funerals in 1 week, but we never thought we would see an attack like that on American soil. So that was 2018. This one you may not know, and this is a Chabad center at a university in 2020 that an arsonist set on fire. You may also not know this one. 6 New York synagogues attacked in just a period of a few days in New York City. And this one perhaps you remember only because it made recent news. The shooting outside the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., where there was a gathering that the American Jewish Committee convened there. They were bringing together diplomats in the Washington, D.C. community and young Jewish professionals to talk about humanitarian issues. And a gunman who was shouting "Free Palestine" shot this beautiful young couple and murdered them in cold blood. So the question is, how did we get to this moment? And I've only picked out the episodes of violence. I haven't talked about all of the other things. So how did we get here? So I'm going to take you back into American history. And we're going to start with Peter Stuyvesant. Any of you ever hear of Stuyvesant? Yeah, okay, right? All right, so maybe some of you went to Stuyvesant High School in New York City. But what you won't remember is that Peter Stuyvesant was, although the word hadn't been invented yet, he was an anti-Semite. When 23 Jews landed in Manhattan, where he was the governor, in September of 1654, he wrote a letter to the Dutch West India Company, which owned the colony, which made the colony's policy, so we had to send it across the ocean back to Amsterdam. He wrote a letter in which he denounced this deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ, and he called them usurers, and he wanted them to be expelled from the colony. Now, he didn't get his way. Had he gotten his way, we probably wouldn't be here. Maybe the Jews would never have made it to New York. But I want you to understand the images that he was evoking. He was calling the Jews usurers, moneylenders. This comes out of the Middle Ages. He actually uses the words that they shouldn't be allowed to infect and trouble this new colony. He was invoking the old trope of the Jews being poisoners of wills, carrying the bubonic plague, the Black Death. About the only thing he was missing in his repetition of old medieval stereotypes about the Jews was the blood libel. But that's okay, because let me tell you, there were plenty of ministers in colonial America who were very happy to mention the blood libel. So that is the opening of anti-Judaism in America. And I'm going to skip, I'm going to just jump 200 years for the purposes of this talk, because we get another example of anti-Judaism, also invented before the word anti-Semitism comes up, and that one comes from Ulysses S. Grant, right? So Grant was he was the general in charge of a huge section of the Northern Army in a district that actually ran, it was called the Tennessee District, but it ran, I think that's what it was called, but it ran from southern Illinois all the way down to New Orleans. And in December of 1862, he decided that he would expel the Jews from his territory. And because of the intervention of Lincoln, it was quickly overturned. We think about 100 Jews were affected. Jonathan Sarna wrote a terrific book about this. But the point is, what did that say to America's Jews? And what it said to them was that America was also going to be a place where Jews were expelled from. And this map shows you some of the medieval and early modern expulsions. The Jews were kicked out of England in 1290. They were kicked out of France starting in 1391 and then continuing again. They'd come back, then they get kicked out again. And of course, the great expulsion of the Jews in 1492 from Spain, and 1497 from Portugal. So what jumps out at me in these two incidents is that we have almost all of the ideas of classical anti-Judaism expressed on American soil well before we get to the invention of the term anti-Semitism. And so I wanted to make this distinction for you because I think most people don't understand it. So this is a terrific book by David Nirenberg, historian now at Princeton. He used to be at the University of Chicago. And he wrote a book about anti-Judaism, which he shows that actually from antiquity, even before the birth of Jesus, down until the early modern period, that the way that Christians talked about their enemies who didn't, have the same political or religious position they had, was they would call them Jews, even in places where the Jews had been kicked out and there were no Jews. So how do we get to the word anti-Semitism? We don't get to it until 1877. It was coined in Germany by a man named Wilhelm Marr, and I do write about this in the book because we need to understand the terminology. And Marr he wanted to find a word that would express opposition to the Jewish people that wasn't religiously based, because he lived in an era when social Darwinism was taught with a tremendous amount of writing, both in Europe and in America, about the different racial groups and the hierarchy of the different racial groups. And for Marr, Jews were at the very bottom of the racial groups, and so he looked for a term and he picked up the idea of Semite from the Semitic languages. Semitic languages are languages that are related to Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic. There is no such thing as a Semitic people. There are only Semitic languages. So how do we define anti-Semitism? How do we define it? And then also, it raises an issue about how to spell it. So anti-Semitism was traditionally spelled until really about a decade ago with a hyphen and a capital S, right? If you type it into Microsoft Word, it's going to correct it to that. So for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance said, no, don't spell it that way because there are no Semitic peoples. Spell it no hyphen, no S, or as Deborah Lipstadt said in her wonderful book, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, that no term like that deserves a capital letter. It's just not worthy of having its own capital letter. So it should be spelled anti-Semitism, and you'll see in this Understanding Anti-Semitism guide that I wrote for American University that that's how we spell it. And I want to just point out something that has just happened. The Biden administration, when it published its guide to combating anti-Semitism, it spelled it with no hyphen, no capital. the Trump administration has reinstated the spelling of anti-Semitism with the hyphen and the capital in its task force to combat anti-Semitism. And it's quite an astonishing change to see the level, the extent of the details that are getting changed at the moment. But for Marr, the Jews and the
Anything that
Germans
Biden did.
were locked in an ethnical struggle, and he thought the Jews were winning. And if the Semites, that the Jews, won, he said it would, and I'm quoting, bring about the end of Germany. And of course, Marr's ideas were adopted by the Nazis, and we know what happened. As a result of that, he founded the first League of Anti-Semites in Germany. And we also, in this moment in time, Marr didn't take so many pains to define the word anti-Semitism, but there's a huge debate about how to define what anti-Semitism is. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance has a definition. Nexus has a definition. There's a Jerusalem definition. The Jews just keep debating about how to define the term. I'll tell you my favorite definition that my favorite definition. Is it up there? Yeah. I attributed to Isaiah Berlin, someone who hates Jews more than necessary. So I think that's the easiest and the most useful. I will tell you that in the book I did not define anti-Semitism. When my colleagues read it, he said, you had no need to, there is no question, every single one of your examples is anti-Semitic. So what's going on at the same time as Marr? By the way, the word anti-Semitism comes to America immediately. I found it in American newspapers by 1880 with no problems. So what's going on at the end of this era of the 19th century? So this is a period when anti-Semitism begins to burst out. We talk about it as a full-fledged anti-Semitic society that I showed you that slide earlier, but here it is in the U.S. So Joseph Seligman was excluded from the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs, New York. They fight about it on the front pages of the New York Times, and it becomes a major international affair, and ultimately leads to the owner of the hotel at that point. He eventually goes bankrupt. But it's this exclusion that is saying, and Joseph Seligman and his family used to stay at the Grand Union Hotel, but now they have a new no Israelites policy. And they do that at the same time that, of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is in force, and it leads historians to think that this was kind of a social exclusion. It was really a legal exclusion. This was really all the lawyers in the room. This was a legal issue. So that happens. We have cartoons like this one. Remember my comment about the Charlottesville marchers, Jews will not replace us? This is the end of the 19th century, where the Jews, these are parvenu Jews, these are not the East European immigrants, and look at the sign. John Smith's sign is being taken down, and the sign Moses Levy and Sons is coming up, that over there, that big sign. And if there are a lot of cartoons like this that are published at that moment in time, where you see it's the Jerusalem Herald, not the New York Herald, the names of the stores are Jewish stores. There's a sense the Jews are replacing the real Americans. This is also the era when we begin to get images, let's see, like the one on the right, which I may be blocking a little bit from seeing, but the one over there is a classic medieval image, right? The Jews, they're devils, they've got horns, they've got big noses, they're wicked. This one over here is showing you, it's from a postcard sent in the 1890s, composed in the 1890s, sent to Germany. The note in German on it says that I'm showing you what some of my countrymen look like. It's part of the Arthur Langerfeld collection in Europe, and everybody in that image is racialized, not only the Jews. And I wanted to tell you something personal that happened about that, because I used that in a talk I was giving at American University, and a faculty member called the provost to say that I was being racist by using that image. And I was saying, no, I'm a historian, this is an 1890s image, and everybody's being racialized, and that's exactly what the argument is. But of course, what they were trying to do was to silence me from showing that. Okay, and then the other big issue in this period of sort of the full-fledged anti-Semitic society, some of you will know this, and this is Leo Frank and Mary Fagan. In 1913, he was accused of having murdered his employee.
We need the
wait.
slide.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you. And Mary Fagan was his employee, he was murdered. And the issue about that trial is sometimes it's told in different ways, but people don't talk about the anti-Semitism in the trial. But Leo Frank's mother wrote a letter to the Washington Post in which she talked about the innuendos and the aspersions that were cast upon her faith during her son's trial. And so there is no question that anti-Semitism figured in it. Frank's lawyer actually said in the closing arguments at the trial, before he was sentenced to death, said that were he not a Jew, this never would have happened, because he was convicted largely on the testimony of an African-American ex-convict. And of course, you know that Frank was then sentenced to death, was pardoned, not pardoned, but his sentence was changed to life imprisonment, and because the governor became convinced that that there had been a miscarriage of justice, he actually uses language about not wanting to see a miscarriage of justice done to Frank the way it had been done to Jesus, and so he changed his life sentence, and then without firing a shot, some good citizens of Marietta, Georgia, took him out of jail and lynched him in 1915. Okay, so I got you up to World War I. So now we're going to go from World War I through World War II and a bit beyond. The great purveyor of anti-Semitism in America in the 1920s was Henry Ford. Henry Ford, who, as you know, was, we don't really know why he became so anti-Semitic. There are all sorts of suppositions about it. But Ford, in his magazine, The Dearborn Independent, published for 91 weeks a series called The International Jew, The World's Problem. When it was published as 4 books, he called it The International Jew, The World's Foremost Problem. It was translated into multiple languages. It was never copyrighted, so it's still in print today. And one of the things that it repeats that he actually reprints in the Dearborn Independent is he reprints the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a text written in Russia in 1903, brought to America by white nationalists from Russia fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution, translated, and then published here. And the amazing thing about Ford is that this newspaper article shows it. A reporter for one of the Chicago newspapers, I think the Trib, interviewed the head of the Bavarian Fascist Party in March of 1923. This is before he's tried to overthrow the Weimar Republic. And in the newspaper, Hitler, the head of the party, talks about how much he admires Ford and how much he would like to send some of his shock troops to America because he's especially fond of Ford's anti-Jewish policy, which is the same as his. Okay, so it makes a huge, huge impression in Germany, and you can still find the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, even recently at the U.S. Capitol, where they were spotted on the desk of a guard. So, so that's going on the one side. On the other side is the 1920s become the era when Jews begin to suffer major structural discrimination in the United States. When Harvard decides to institute a quota on the number of Jewish students, a quota that the president of Harvard, this correspondence ends up on the front page of the New York Times, the president of Harvard defends because that's how you can stop anti-Semitism. If you don't have so many Jews in the school, then there won't be the problem any longer. And so that happens. The extent of economic discrimination against Jews in America in the 20s and 30s is so stunning that people haven't realized why so many Jews went into small businesses. They went into small businesses because the largest corporations in America, like AT&T, would not hire Jews. They went into they went, in order to become physicians, they went overseas because they couldn't get into medical schools in the United States. And then, of course, and they would often go to German schools, and then by the 30s, that's not possible. And signs like this one dotted the American landscape. I remember reading about Ruth Bader Ginsburg as maybe an adolescent with her family, taking a road trip in America and seeing these signs everywhere. So the extent of anti-Semitism in the 20s, 30s, 40s, into the 50s, and actually the college quotas don't really begin to fall till the 60s, is really astonishing. We tend to think that the anti-Semitism in America kind of ended in 1945. It didn't end in 1945. It actually continued significantly. So that gives you just some sense of the breadth of the history. But what I want to do now is I want to talk about anti-Semitism coming from the right and coming from the left, and showing you how it kind of weaves through the American trajectory. So we opened here with white nationalists chanting "Jews will not replace us" at the Unite the Right rally. And so the real question is, what does this mean? So on the one hand, what it means is, Jews are not going to replace whites in our jobs and our rightful place as the dominant power in society. But 6 weeks before the Unite the Right rally, Eric Ward, a remarkable individual, a racial justice advocate, published one of the most influential essays that I've seen on this subject. It was called "Skin in the Game." Ward, whom I know personally, in the essay he says this. He grew up as a Los Angeles punk, so it's okay to say that since he wrote it himself. And he, in the 90s, he felt to understand the other side, what he had to do was he had to go to their meetings. So here's this black man hanging out at white nationalist meetings, and he figures out that what they are convinced is that the Jews are at the basis of the racial justice movement. The white nationalists believe that black people are inferior and that they cannot possibly orchestrate the civil rights movement and the social justice movements that they have orchestrated it. So who does this? It's the Jews. The Jews, the old puppet masters of the conspiracy theories, like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And so they're also convinced, and he says this in the essay, Jews are so smart, they convinced the rest of the whites that Jews are white. For the white nationalists, the Jews are not white. They are another race, a nefarious race. And so I want to show you this image. Go there. So, do you remember when Kanye West first began ranting against the Jews, right? This is what year is that? Do I have a date on it? 2022. So this is over the highway, Highway 405 in Los Angeles. And this small group, they're called the Goyim Defense League, they hang out this banner on the highway, and it says, honk if you think Kanye is right. But what drives me to use this image is I want you to look at the quotations at the bottom of one of the banners. One is from Revelations, one is from the book of John, and what they say is, these are quotations about to the Jews, that your father is the devil and that you worship in the synagogue of Satan. And I pull this out because you can, or at least I can, separate out contemporary anti-Semitic expressions from the classic anti-Judaism. They combined it for us, right? They are part and parcel of this same hate. Talia Lavin noticed the same thing when she wrote her book, Culture of Warlords. And of course, Charlottesville brought it out into the open. The white race is endangered, the most endangered race. And sometimes in anti-Semitic imagery, you see certain numbers. I don't know if you've noticed this, but sometimes you'll see something that will say 14 or 88, and I want to explain those. So there was a man named David Lane who went to jail for being involved in the murder of the Jewish talk show host Alan Berg in 1985. He died in jail, but he wrote a manifesto there that deeply influences the white nationalist movement, and it ends with these last 14 words that, again, convince that the Western nations are ruled by the Zionists, so classic conspiracy theory, and it ends with these words: we must secure the existence of our people and a future for our white children. And so he's the one who popularized this idea of white genocide, and this was a mile from my house in Bethesda, and so the swastika is white power. 14, for David Lane's 14 words. 88, any guesses? H. H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. Heil Hitler. Okay? So, and we've had, I mean, this has become, this is the way white nationalists signal that they've arrived, they've been. So that's anti-Semitism from the right. Here it is from the left. So, since October 7th, 2023, the focus, very much, certainly in terms of the news, has been on the anti-Semitism coming from the left. And it's almost like it didn't exist before, which is totally wrong. Anti-Semitism on the left has a long history. It actually, and anti-Zionism on the left, it actually goes back to the Soviets. The Soviets outlawed anti-Semitism, but they were anti-Zionist. And they were very good at exporting their anti-Zionism to the West. And so we saw, for example, it's more recent history than some of the other things, but 1975, let me see, where am I? It was up, 1975, yeah, there it is. The UN General Assembly passed a resolution saying that anti-Semitism is racism. It was eventually repealed. You can actually hear the speech given by the UN ambassador to the UN, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, denouncing this outrage. Anti-Zionism was on display at Durban. Yeah, that's Durban. In 2001, I don't know if you remember this international conference that the UN held in 2001, early in September, and the anti-Semitism in the streets at the non-governmental organizations was so vitriolic that the Israeli delegation and the American delegations actually left the conference. People would remember Durban if it had not been followed by 9/11. Durban was making headlines, and then of course 9/11 happened, and it was being exported to the college campuses already. This anti-apartheid wall of Columbia is from 2016, not from now. It's not new. And then, of course, as you know, more recently, the encampments and the demonstrations, the graffiti on campuses, and most recently, the New York Times editorial on anti-Semitism as an urgent problem. So, as I said, I worked on this book for over 6 years, but I have multiple origin stories up into this book. As I think about what led me to write it, obviously, I really began working on it after Tree of Life. I'm just shocked by what's happened to Tree of Life. As we're a group of historians, we all began meeting, like, how would we miss this? We've been writing about all sorts of things about Jewish success in America. But if I go back to graduate school, which was a very long time ago, I go back to graduate school, I remember being in the library at Ohio State University one day and pulling off the shelf a book written by Simon Wiesenthal. That name ring a bell? The Nazi headhunter. And I opened the book, and inside it was an anti-Semitic flyer. Somebody knew enough to go into the OSU library stacks and knew enough to target that book. I think I probably called the Anti-Defamation League to report it, maybe not. I'm really sorry as a historian I didn't save that flyer, but I think I've been thinking about anti-Semitism for almost my entire career. So thank you. I welcome your questions. I welcome your comments. I know my slides were not as smooth as I would like them to be, but it was also my first attempt.
If you have a question, please let me know. I'll hand you the microphone so people outside can also hear you.
Well,
So you've addressed the what of anti-Semitism, but you haven't addressed the why. Can you address the why?
that's not true.
So, anti-Semitism, I mean, everybody keeps trying to figure this out, right? Anti-Semitism movements have came flourish at certain particular times, particular moments. Ted Deutsch talked about this yesterday at the Hall of Philosophy, that we're in a moment where so much of what we thought was essentially the norm in America is under attack and has been under attack in some really striking ways, frankly, since 2016. So that things that people used to think but would never dare to openly voice, you now can voice. Deborah Lipstadt said she used to talk about the canary in the gold mine. That canary already died. That we are in an era of, and the other thing is we're in an era of rising worldwide anti-Semitism, and frankly, Israel has become one of the major engines for driving worldwide anti-Semitism, which is what was going on in Durban, what is going on the anti-Semitism on the left. And it is heartbreaking that the nation that was founded to solve the problem of anti-Semitism is now what has become one of the chief targets of anti-Semitism in American life. And people try to parse out when is anti-Israel, opposition, when is opposition to Israel's policies. For some Jews, opposition to Israel's policies is ipso facto anti-Semitic. But if you would say that, then the hundreds of thousands of Israelis that were out there protesting their government until October 7th, every Saturday night they were out there, you would have to call them anti-Semitic. But I would say that opposition to Israel, when it takes the forms of classic anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, equation with the Nazis, denial of the legitimacy of the state, that is when it crosses the anti-Semitic line.
Good definition.
But it's an incredible international phenomenon. So what's going on in America is just part of what's going on in the world. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'd be interested in your views on what is happening right now between the government and college campuses and the Trump administration using or claiming that it is fighting anti-Semitism on campuses, and that has been used as their rationale for going after elite liberal universities. What's your thoughts about that?
So one of the advantages of having been in a hearing that was viral and not getting fired is that that hearing went on for 5 hours, right? And the part that everybody knows about happened over like 90 seconds. And I had a lot of time to think as I was sitting in that hearing because I didn't get that many questions. And I had known that the month before, candidate Trump had published a plan that what he was going to do if he was elected was he was going to tax the endowments of the universities, and he was going to use that to create a free online university whose graduates would not be allowed to be woke or jihadists, that's a direct quote, and then they would go to work for the government. And I was convinced that what I saw that day was the opening attack on the universities, which, by the way, J.D. Vance in 2021 talked about that he was going to, quote, attack the universities. That was the only way to achieve the conservative goals. So what happened is that plan to tax the endowment of the universities disappeared because a better plan came up when Trump was in office. And that was he could weaponize anti-Semitism to go after the universities. And as the judge in the Harvard case said just a week or two ago, and when there was a pretrial hearing or a summary injunction hearing, the judge said to the lawyer from the Justice Department, explain to me why canceling cancer research, by the way, my daughter was a cancer researcher at Harvard, why canceling cancer research is going to solve anti-Semitism. So what I think we have is we have a plan, a long-standing plan, and then they're using the megaphone around anti-Semitism to go after the universities, and Comey just paid $220 million. Brown is going to pay $50 million. Who knows if Harvard is going to pay the $500 million the press is reporting or not. But the point is, they want to grab the money from the endowments. And what people don't remember is in that hearing with the other presidents, they were asked, what is the size of your endowment? They were getting it out on the table. And Claudine Gay said, what, 56 million, 53 million? Billion.
Give or take a few billion.
Yeah, she said, this is my husband at Harvard, said give or take a few billion. Yeah, it was kind of amazing. So what we're seeing is a long-standing plan. They just found a different strategy, but it is going to come back to haunt the Jews. Because American research is no longer the premier scientific and medical research in the world. The Jews will be blamed because supposedly it was solving the plight of anti-Semitism. It will not solve the plight of anti-Semitism. Yeah, we have to let Dan know, okay? Also, all right, yeah. We have to let Dan. All right, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go. I just want to make sure the microphone gets
Use the microphone.
I was wondering if you could address groups like Jewish Voice for Peace that have formed a coalition, particularly on university campuses, with Faculty for Justice in Palestine. They're pro-BDS, they're very anti-Zionist, and even writers who are presumably respectable, like Peter Beinart, are given a voice in the New York Times regularly, and they are preaching anti-Zionist viewpoints and against the state of Israel.
Right. So what what my generation, a lot of us are the same generation, what we like to think is that the American Jewish community shares our vision of Israel. If you read a terrific book by Joshua Leifer called Tablet Shattered, you will see, you read it, I see, you will see the extent of the division in Israel, around Israel, in the American Jewish community, especially among young people. So they grew up, like I grew up with Ari Ben Canaan, right? You know, from the book of Exodus. I grew up with the narrative of, you know, Israel rising like the phoenix out of the ashes. But they grew up with Netanyahu's government. And they grew up with the language about settler colonialism and apartheid and genocide. And there is a divide in the American Jewish community. In fact, we were at a dinner with a bunch of med students from George Washington University, and the faculty in the room all said, you know, like this classic, like how could they take this position? And the young med students in the room said, no, there are a lot of people who feel this way. And so this is what you're seeing with Jewish Voices for Peace, the students in Jewish Voices for Peace. They are appalled by what has happened to the Israeli story. Do they want to see Israel destroyed and a second Holocaust, this time of 7 million Jews? I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about the position, and I'm sure there's division along there, but they see a grave injustice in the world. And their point of view is also, you know, it's amplified by people like Peter Beinart. Red Stevens will no longer appear on stage with Peter Beinart, he would before. But Jews have always argued among themselves, taking different points of view. And so this is one of the kind of classic continuations of that discussion.
So, I'm Dan Horowitz, 3 historical footnotes. First about Harvard.
Could you hold it closer?
First about Harvard and Trump. You may disagree with me, but I cannot think of a presidential administration filled with anti-Semites compared to this one. And on the other hand, Harvard, the president of the university, Alan Garber, an observant Jew, we've seen him read the Torah portion at Yom Kippur. The provost, chief academic officer, a political conservative and Jew, and the chief, the head of the Harvard Corporation, Penny Pritzker, whose family, of course, is tangled with Trump, also a Jew. Second thing, this is a historian's footnote. So, when Leo Frank is in prison, a lawyer named Borston, the father of Daniel J. Borston, visits him and is in mourning when Frank is lynched, and moves from Atlanta to Tulsa for that reason. But of course, he moves almost right into what became another massacre in Tulsa. And there his son, Daniel Borston, an eminent historian, later Librarian of Congress, this is in a book by Borston's son, John. Borston becomes a friend with John Hope Franklin, the most eminent and important African-American historian. They both end up at University of Chicago. Third footnote, Judy and my father, William Horowitz, Yale 1929. In 1960, as I'm graduating Yale, goes to his classmate, the president of Yale, and says, do you know there's a quota? And the president, A. Whitney Griswold, inheritor of 6 grand ancestors who were colonial governors, Griswold says, I don't believe it. But Griswold dictates a memo after my father leaves, and that's the beginning of the end of the Yale Jewish.
Wow. So I'm going to respond to your comments. Those are amazing, amazing. Dan Oren wrote, is a good friend, wrote an amazing book about the history of anti-Semitism, the history of Jews at Yale. Yeah, so definitely. Yeah, joining the club, so I definitely recommend that. So the interesting about the comment about the Borstons moved to Tulsa after Leo Frank's lynching. There are a bunch of sources that say half the Jews in Georgia left after Leo Frank's lynching. But none of them look legitimate to me, none of those sources, and somebody questioned me. I used it once, I think, maybe in a talk that I did online. So we know Jews left. There's no question that Jews left Georgia. How many actually left? But I didn't know about the Borstons. But you are spot on the anti-Semitism coming from segments of the right-wing leadership in the United States. I spent almost 9 months in conversation with 3 New York Times reporters, basically giving them sort of like I was writing the book, and then they would ask me questions, and I would go back and write like some of what they were asking. And they wrote an article that appeared on the front page of the New York Times about the use of anti-Semitic tropes around globalism and Soros. And they showed that they're data analysts, so they showed how they had shot up between 2016 from Republican leadership, and then when this was published in the spring of 2020, I think it's spring of 2024. And there's no question that anti-Semitism is coming from the right in so many different ways. I talked mostly about the violence, but it is there and is being amplified. And it is what makes this moment so difficult, because in the 1920s and 30s, 1920s I talked about structural anti-Semitism. I didn't talk about the Nazis in America in the 1930s. I write about them. But there's relatively little anti-Semitism coming from the left in America now. But now it's coming from both sides. Good question. I think we have maybe another, oh, okay, yeah. Hi.
Hi, excuse me. I'm a current federal worker at MNH. And the new executive order that just came out about being able to talk about religion in the workplace. There's definitely going to be a test to this executive order. What do you see as how far someone could go in the workplace before someone says, stop,
Right.
or it's enough?
Yeah. So the executive order is about being allowed, it's sort of, you're allowed to proselytize in the workplace, right? What's the language of it?
It says you're allowed to talk about it.
To talk about it, to talk about it.
Proselytizing is becoming the word.
Right. And so Mira Fox wrote a great article in the Forward the other day about the time that her violin teacher tried to teach her about Jesus. And what we're seeing is, there will be a test, because it certainly is the question about, where is the line and how high is the wall between separation of church and state. And this is an administration that very much, despite its theoretical embrace of of protecting Jews, is actually very much promoting Christianity and Christian doctrine. And this is scary. I mean, but you know what? Everything's scary. Right? I mean, it's sort of like I just reel from day to day, right? Right? So now we don't have legitimate labor statistics any longer, right? Yeah.
We have a question from outside.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, this is Steve Peters.
Hey,
What has become a very prescient book for me is a book that Hannah Arendt wrote in the 40s, trying to understand anti-Semitism in Europe. And almost the first third of that book describes the origins of anti-Semitism in Europe. It's an unbelievable read.
Yeah.
And it is so applicable to today that it's truly frightening.
Yeah.
If you want to understand how European anti-Semitism evolved, her first third of that book really nails it on that.
Yeah, it's, and there's been, it's interesting, there's been a lot of interest in Iran also at the moment. Also, there's a lot of interest at the moment in Alfred Dreyfus, sort of the, at the end of the 19th century, if you could have imagined the Holocaust, you would have thought it would have happened in France, right? So there's, he just got promoted to Brigadier General by the French National Assembly. Yeah.
There's a whole discussion of brightness.
Yeah.
Hi, first of all, thank you for mentioning Tablet Shattered. I think it's a really important book for
Can you hold
those
that
of us.
closer, please?
Tablet Shattered, I think, is an important read for those of us in this generation to understand a lot more about young people and where they're coming from. But and also that the Frank story in Parade, the Broadway musical that is not on Broadway anymore, but it's
on national
it's touring now.
It's actually at the Kennedy Center.
Yeah.
Which has not yet been renamed. No, I know it's there.
I've been curious because who's funding the left movement? Because I'm thinking it was huge, especially right before the election, and you couldn't walk on the street in Chicago and not have lots of protests going on. What was behind that?
So the short answer is, I don't know, but somebody is. I have, almost every time I talk to a journalist who has questions about what's happening on the left, I ask, who is following the money? I know that there are efforts, some groups are looking into that. Those tents, those encampment tents, those were expensive, right? And they all matched in lots of places. And also what's interesting is I saw a graph of where the encampments took place, and they took place by and large at wealthy universities. So I don't have the answer, but you and I think, are thinking similarly that these were not funded by the students.
Right.
That was my question. I was going to, on October 8th, before Israel did anything, they were protesting. So obviously there was money behind it. And I think Qatar is responsible, and I think someone needs to really dig into that to find out how all those protests were funded.
Yeah, I agree.
Can you pass it down that way?
Hey.
I was just wondering.
Hold it very close, because you can't.
I was just wondering, before October 8th, what do you think was the situation in terms of anti-Semitism on the campuses? Was it as bad as Trump was saying now?
So before October 8th, it was bad, but people weren't paying attention to it. That there were, and one of the things that happened is, let's be honest, the universities were caught flat-footed on October 8th. Universities have student conduct codes. Most of them have not been looked at in like 15 years. Like some VP every summer would have to look it over and okay, no changes. They were not updated. They didn't know what doxing was. They didn't have things about encampments, and they were not, and whatever kind of enforcement mechanisms that they were not sufficient to respond to what was going on. So what happened subsequently is that over the course of that, 23-24 academic year, things were a mess. Things got much quieter in the 24-25 academic year. Encampments were down over 90%. Graffiti and vandalism was down over 50%. But where did it shoot up? It shot up on social media. And when it shot up on social media, it shot up in ways that used classic anti-Semitic tropes of, blood-flecked Jews, eating human babies, and all sorts of things. So there's no question that this anti-Zionism that we're seeing on social media is anti-Semitic. Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay. Last question.
It's always been my sense that anti-Semitism in America was cyclical. But I get the impression from you that the anti-Semitism is really a constant, and it's the degree of suppression of the anti-Semitism that is cyclical.
So I called one chapter in the book, "No Age is Entirely Golden." So you may know that Franklin Foer wrote a cover story in the Atlantic about a year or so ago, the end of the golden age of American Jewry. 3 years before that, 2 years before that, I had a debate with Brett Stevens at the American Jewish Committee's Global Forum, where the topic was, is the golden age of American Jewry ending already? So we've been talking about that, but what I was able to document is that in this period from post-war to the end of the 21st century, there are lots of moments of anti-Semitism, and people don't remember them. And the reason we didn't know about them is, and the reason I can find them now, is that now local newspapers are digitized, right? So all of a sudden I can look up X, Y, or Z. So I'll tell you one story that appears in there. So I was talking to a friend of mine, Shaul Kellner, who just wrote this amazing book, I think I mentioned it the other day, about the Jews and the involvement in the Soviet Jewry movement. We're at a conference together last April, a year ago April, and I said, this is how I got into this book. I kept asking people questions. I kept saying, like, did you ever experience anti-Semitism? I started doing that with my last book tour, which is how I started writing this book. And he said, well, no. And I said, well, there was the time that the guys, they stole the bulldozer and they bulldozed the wall of the brand new synagogue. So what did I do? I went to look in the New Jersey newspapers to see what I could find. Now, what he did not remember was that they wrote on the side of the synagogue, "Kill the Jews." Okay? So I have just a handful of these incidents. They're all over America. And they were happening locally, and there's also not just attacks on buildings, there's also violence, arson, even in this so-called golden age. But the extent, post-October 8th, is what has shocked us. Need one more?
Excuse me. When did the quotas begin in colleges and universities?
So they begin in actually it begins at Columbia before 1922, like 1918, 1919. But what people don't remember is they spread to 700 colleges and universities across America, and public universities couldn't discriminate that way, so they found other ways of discriminating. Yeah. So great. So thank you so much for being here.
Another good one.